Livestream audio test 1 2. Livestream audio check 1 2 1 2. Audio check 1 2. Audio check 1 2.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It's just 2, so the inquiry is now resumed. In a moment, we're going to hear the council's heritage evidence. Just need to check. Is there anybody here that wishes to speak to the inquiry that I've not heard from? No? Okay. Well, please do sign the attendance sheet as well. That would help me. Okay. Is there anything else that either of the parties want to make me aware of after the break? That's good news. Okay. Thank you. It's helpful to know.
No problem at all. Shall I introduce Dr. Kate Hudson-Macaulay, sir?
Please do.
Thank you very much. So, you are Dr. Kate Hudson-Macaulay, are you not?
Yes, I am.
Well, that's a relief. And you hold a Bachelor of Science degree with honours in Conservation of Objects in Museums and Archaeology.
Yes.
A Master of Science degree in Conservation of Historic Buildings, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Chemistry, where you focused on the structural and mechanical integrity of historic wood.
Yes.
Is that correct? And you're an associate of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation. You're employed by North Somerset Council as its Senior Conservation and Heritage Officer, and you've been doing that for some 6.5 years, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you're attending this inquiry to give evidence on the question of whether or not the appeal proposals would cause harm to the significance of 2 designated heritage assets. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And those assets are the Church of St. John the Baptist and the Churchill Conservation Area.
Yes.
And to that end, you've prepared a proof of evidence, which we've all read, so we don't need to trawl through it. And you've put in a number of appendices, which again the inspector will have seen, so we don't need to worry about those. You'll be taken to them in due course if you need to be. So, without further ado, shall we get down to brass tacks? And could I ask you this, that I think it's been suggested that when the conservation area was designated, certain open land, part of which lies within the appeal site, was incorporated within it, which you say in your evidence contributes to the significance of the conservation area, and which Mr. Sutton says does not. So there's a bit of a conflict there. Tell me, please, how does the open land, which is comprised within the appeal site, and which is also within the conservation area, contribute to its significance? Take your time and speak up.
It contributes to the significance of the conservation area through its historic value and its aesthetic value. Historic value is broken down into illustrative value and associated value. It has illustrative value in the way that you can view the built form of the conservation area from the rear of the site when you look at Front Street. Sorry.
Take time. Right. So where we've got to is you said we've got to consider illustrative value and associative value. And what you were doing was you were just explaining why the land has certain illustrative value. So just take your time and tell us, how does it?
Well, it's the historic development of the town. From that area, you do get a different vantage point of the conservation area.
Yeah.
You can see the historic development of Front Street, as Front Street changes from its more dense built-up front core, which sits at the bottom around the church tower.
Yeah.
It then begins to phase out, as all hierarchy of settlements do. You have the busy centres, they then phase out into the more open, bigger plots of land that you can then see phasing into the countryside on the edge of settlements. It's generally the character of historic dwellings where you have that busy centre and then it moves out, and you can see that from this area. You can see the roof lines from that part of the conservation area of some of the historic buildings. You can also see the copula of Sydney Hill cottages when you look across the site, which is the ornate piece of that Grade 2 listed building through the site. You can also see other historic buildings such as Barrow cottages. Admittedly, some of these views are seasonal, depending on hedgerows through there, but you can experience those and the thinning out of the settlement as you transition from that very, well, not very built up, the more built up core throughout to the...
Okay, so what you've told us is you can see something of a transition of history, if you like. Where are you standing when you're seeing this transition?
If you stand within that parcel of land that's in the conservation area, on the diagonal path that comes through, admittedly at the moment you can't get to it, but you can also see it from the current right-of-way that moves around the outside of the site.
Yeah, so you're standing there and you're looking to the south.
Yes.
And what it is you see is just try and encapsulate it in a nutshell if you can.
Oh, you can see the roof line of the buildings that are part of the conservation area as they move out into the urban area. You can also, rural area. You can also see the backdrop of the Mendip Hills AOMB from this site, which also adds character to the area.
Yeah, and what you're saying is, what you just told us is, if one's trying to categorise that in, I think, in terms of historic England's guidance.
So sorry to interject. Is that alarm anything we need to alarm ourselves with, or is that being dealt with? Okay.
Is that irritating? Yeah, is it putting you off? So should we just get
It's
on?
not putting me off, but it is annoying.
It sounds like a car alarm, doesn't it?
Yeah, I assumed it wasn't the fire alarm, because
No,
I'd expect
well,
that to be much
But when
louder.
that goes off, so you'll know about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this illustrative value is that which you perceive as it from the footpath looking south towards the front street east-west axis, and the illustrative value is just for my note, just nail it. What is that illustrative value? What does it illustrate?
It's illustrating the built form of the conservation area as it moves from the hierarchical core at the start. You can see it move out into the more urban area and thin out to bigger plot lines as you get bigger buildings and bigger plots towards the side. It's also illustrative of a historic event where the village itself has now moved away from the original nucleus of the church. Is illustrative of that historic event.
Yeah.
You can see that within the area.
Good. So we've got illustrative in the sense of it shows how the built form has, if you like, developed.
Yes.
And it's illustrative in the sense that it shows us different phases in the village's development.
Yes.
Is that it?
Yes.
I wonder if you could just pull your microphone
Oh, yep.
a little bit closer.
I could just speak up as well. shouldn't
Well, that's better.
I? Right.
Good. So that
Okay.
nails the illustrative point. Now the associative point. Tell us, how does including that land within the conservation area provide associative value?
It has associative view lines through to the church. It associates. You can associate the heritage assets with each other with the view lines through to the church from that area. It also has associative value with its landscape. You can see the Mendip Hills from there. You can see the pattern of development is moving towards the bigger core of the conservation area around the church tower, and it has this organic beauty of the landscape that you can the organic formation of the buildings in with the landscape.
Okay, good. Now, dealt with illustrative value, we've dealt with associative value. Is there any other value arising from putting, or rather designating, part of the appeal site as conservation area?
Well, it has an aesthetic value, aesthetic value in the way that it speaks to that semi-rural, rural character of Churchill Conservation Area. It is open land that you can see and appreciate the rural ambience of that area. You also get a very good experience as a person moving through that area. It adds to the experience of the conservation area. It's not just about the built form. A conservation area never is just about the built form. It is a part of it, but the layouts and the lanes and the views that you get from these places in the conservation area also add to the experience, and that adds to its significance. When you walk down the public footpath that goes between, it's not quite Barrow Cottage, it's the buildings just afterwards. You walk through that path and then you're revealed into this open rural character, which is part of the conservation area. You can still see the built form of some of the buildings as you move out to that side, but it is opened up and you can appreciate views through to the countryside, which is of more natural beauty. They're not designed views, but they are important, they are beautiful.
So not designed, but they're important because they're beautiful, and they add beauty to what exactly?
To the rural character of the conservation area.
Yeah. Right. Now, Mr. Garvey will have questions for you about that set of answers, so I shan't labour the point, we'll move on. The appeal site, in addition to being incorporated within the conservation area to some extent, does it provide any element of setting for the conservation area?
Yes, obviously there's only half of the appeal site is within the strict conservation area, as the conservation area was designed as a heritage asset in relation to the village. The setting of the conservation area then allows wider views through to the associated assets, such as the church, and views back to the conservation area that are a bit further. And again, they're a little bit, as you move back in, the screening becomes a little bit more robust, so you see a little bit less in the setting, which is why the setting differs from the character of the actual conservation area itself.
So that part of the appeal site which is setting, but not part of the conservation area?
Yes.
Out of interest, a point raised by Mr. Cook this morning, and it's one I think you ought to address if you would. Were you the officer that produced the conservation area management plan?
I was, yes.
So why didn't you include the whole of the land which comprises the appeal site between the edge of the village and the church? Why not put it all into the conservation area?
Well, as I've already stated, the conservation area was designed to protect and enhance the character of the village, not specifically the church. The church is a listed asset that has its own designation and its own protections in place, such as setting of that asset, and a conservation area in itself also has its own setting, which is a recognised protection within guidance and the MPPF and our own policies. Also, when you're designating a conservation area, you're not meant to include wider landscape. It's not supposed to be used as a designation for landscape. It's supposed to be used for a designation of conservation area, and that is in Historic England's guidance in the conservation area appraisal and designated management plan guidance.
Yeah, well, that's your answer. That's helpful. And that may be explored by others, so I'll move on. Then we come to the church. Now, what is the significance of the church in a nutshell? How does it derive significance?
The church is has a multifaceted significance. It is both has architectural interest, it has historic interest, it also has communal interest. There's also evidential value within the church itself. A lot comes from the building fabric, but the setting of the church also adds to the appreciation of its architectural form and its understanding of its positioning in that landscape. And for this church in particular, the positioning in the landscape in relation to how the village has moved away is a very interesting case. It's it's not common for a church to be completely separate from the village it serves. There has been some sort of historic event where the village has now decided that it does not want to build itself up around the church. What that was, we don't know, but it is in my proof where it states the importance of how the size, character, and position of the church in the landscape is of major importance. That view of the church on its own in that separate nucleus is an interesting and significant factor to its setting.
Yeah. So how would you define the setting of the church?
Well, there are, I don't disagree with Mr. Sutton, there is a more intimate setting, which you get from being more immediately close to the church, where you get from the churchyards itself. But there is an element of significance in its wider setting. From the wider setting, you can appreciate the architectural form in a different way. You can view the building from different angles to appreciate its entirety of its scale and its position in that landscape, which you can't fully appreciate when you're up close. But those views are obviously...
Now, you said earlier it's got aesthetic value.
Yes.
To what extent is that revealed by its setting?
You can appreciate the architectural form, and you can see elements of the church which are interesting from a wider position. You can see the tracery Gothic windows at the top, and you can see there's a small crenellated tower as well that you can get a very good viewpoint from the site itself when you're looking towards the church.
Yeah, and could you obtain the same sort of impression from the immediate vicinity?
You can see elements, but you would have to walk around the church to be able to see everything. You get more of a wider view of the whole tower and elements together from longer views in. Though you can see them up close, but it just gives you a different vantage point to appreciate that asset from and appreciate its visual dominance and its role as a focal point in that landscape.
Yeah, so visual dominance and focal points. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you've told us why certain lands contained within the conservation area. You've told us about the significance of the conservation area. Ditto St. John's Church. What I'd like to understand now, please, is why you object to the development of the appeal site because of what you perceive to be its impact on the conservation area. How will the development harm the significance of the conservation area?
The development has multiple areas where it harms the significance of the conservation area. The land at the rear, which includes the large open space, will be infilled with...
Sorry, the rear of what?
Sorry, the rear of Front Street, which includes the field with the 2 veteran trees in it, which is part of the conservation boundary, the open land. This will be filled with housing, which will compete for attention with Front Street. When you're looking at viewpoints from Windmill Hill back down to the conservation area, you can see there's a linear procession along Front Street. This will then compete with that attention from that viewpoint. You will also block views through from the conservation area and towards the conservation area, which will be filled with housing. It'll also fill in...
Hang on.
Sorry.
Block views from and towards conservation area, which will be filled by houses. Right. When you say it's going to block views from and towards, which views is it going to block from the conservation?
Well, when you travel along the public footpath along the east of the site, we won't be able to see so well through to the open land because it's just going to be filled with housing, and to some extent the screening that they're using to provide a buffer of this land will block views. The trees will also interrupt those views.
And what will it block views of?
The church and the surrounding rural landscape.
Yeah. So if you're heading away from the conservation area, north or west, you're going to block views of the church and other rural views outside of the conservation area, is that it?
Yes.
Right. Now, views towards the conservation area are the other aspect that you just mentioned. So which views are you concerned about? Just identify them, tell us where you are and where you're looking towards, and then tell us how they contribute to significance and how they'll be effective. Just take some stages. So which views are you talking about?
When you go to the viewpoint from the entrance of the public right-of-way, which is opposite the church on that site access.
Right, so you're opposite the church and you're looking towards the conservation area.
Yes,
So what's going to be the effect of the development?
when you go through there, instead of seeing open rural landscape and pastoral fields, you're going to end up seeing screening measures and housing, which will block views through to the buildings that you can see on the fringe of the settlement that's moved out from the core. You won't be able to distinguish them as well through the housing.
So of the elements you mentioned, illustrative, associative and aesthetic, which of those elements are affected by that, if you like, blocking of views?
The aesthetic value, and in some ways the illustrative value that you get from understanding the pattern of development and the pattern of historic development from that part of the conservation area.
Well, you develop that point in your proof, so we don't need to go any further into that now. Views from opposite the church is one viewpoint. Are there any others towards the conservation area you'd like to draw the inspector's attention to?
Well, there are viewpoints that are in my proof as well that are from the aspect of the diagonal path that cuts through the site. Although you can't go there now, this is a historic route through the site. That route has been used for, as far as we're aware, a very long time. That viewpoint will be cluttered with housing and screening measures that will just diminish the character of the area and the appreciation of the aesthetic value of that open land and rural backdrop to the conservation area.
All right. Now, what about views from Windmill Hill? Are they important?
Yes, the views from Windmill Hill are they offer a different appreciation of the conservation area from height. You can see how the historic development has grown along what is the valley between the Mendip Hills and Windmill Hill, how it follows basically the line of the hill. It sits into that hillside, and although you can't see you can see rooftops of those buildings, you can distinguish between the different style of rooftops, the different elements of that conservation area, and you can see how the dense elements filter out almost along the ridgeline. So where you start to lose Windmill Hill and the Windmill Hill comes down, it's almost the housing then starts to thin out, aside from a few 20th century infills.
Okay, and again, what elements of significance will be harmed by filling in the appeal site with houses and other landscaping compared with the present?
Well, the present is an open land which allows you to appreciate the rural backdrop of that conservation area and the rural appearance to its character, which is an important part of this conservation area. When you fill that in with housing, it's going to compete for your attention. You've got that strip of housing that you can see at the front, and then this is going to detract your attention to this new cluster of housing within that rural landscape.
Yeah, and the extent of harm you'd characterise in what terms?
I said it was less than substantial harm to the conservation area and lower end of less than substantial harm to the church.
Okay. Now, just thinking about the church, how does the development within the setting of the church affect its significance, do you say?
Or you lose some appreciation of the church's position in that landscape, which in Churchill's case is a very interesting position in comparison to where the settlement has grown up since the church's origins. You lose, it gets filled in with housing, so it's almost like you're bringing the settlement back towards the church, which is contrary to the historic event of where they've moved it away from the church, and that you lose that appreciation of that event by filling that, by putting housing in that area.
Now, it may be said that, well, hang on a minute, you've got views of the church as a landmark from the west. That was one of the things Mr. Cook mentioned this morning, that there aren't only views of the church from the village. One can see views of the church as one approaches Churchill from the west, along footpaths.
Yes, you can appreciate the church from there, but it's a different angle of the church and a different view of the tower. It is also, as Mr. Cook said, designed to be a 360 landscape element, which is important from views surrounding the church, not just from one specific viewpoint. And these longer views allow you to appreciate the church from different perspectives and viewpoints.
Yeah, right. Now, that's your evidence in summary. It'll be examined. It may be that you'll be told that your approach is wrong. And with that in mind, are there any appeal decisions that you would seek to draw comfort from in support of the case that you advance, compared with that which is advised by the appellants?
Yes, we've had a fair few appeal decisions adjacent to the site and also in the conservation area itself. There are 3 that relate directly to the harm that filling in undeveloped land in the conservation area harms the character of that semi-rural or rural backdrop to the conservation area. We've also got 2 appeal statements that exist from before the conservation area that also speaks to the character of the rurality of the village and how changing that.
So just pausing for a moment, those appeal decisions, are they in the core document?
Yes, they are.
So would you like to take us briefly to each and tell us, please, which parts of each decision you would like the inspector to consider when he writes his report, and just tell us briefly how they make out the evidence that you have given to the inquiry. So I don't want to go into great detail, but identify the decisions by reference to core document number, and if you can, page and paragraph number, then just summarise what it is you want us to take away from those decisions.
That's no problem. The first one I'll draw the attention to is, I feel, the most relevant because it is the adjacent site to the current appeal site. It is the appeal decision, it's document G15. It was an inspector decision by Inspector Jones.
Yep.
I take you to paragraph 6, which explains how the village's rural character is significant to the conservation area.
Yep.
They also discuss in paragraph 9 that the result of building the 5 houses in this area would cause an urbanizing effect to its rural character, and what we've got in the development now is literally 12 times the amount of housing, and if 5 that the inspectors identify as creating urbanization, then it's logical to think that this one would be.
Yes, we've put in a plan earlier in the inquiry, which we don't need to go to, I don't think, which identifies where that particular appeal site is located.
Yes.
Compared with the appeal site in this case.
Yes.
Now, is there anything about the scale or location of the appeal site that we're dealing with in G15 which makes it any less probative of the impact of developing this appeal site?
Well, they go into how it is 5 housing. They were domestic scale housing. They weren't overly large. They were 2-story development housing, and they were within the area. And it was considered that the loss of the open lands and the open green space and the natural backdrop to Churchill Conservation Area was going to be harmed by the 5 housings put in that location.
Yeah.
And also by, Mr. Leader, also by the loss of the hedgerows that are very prominent, and they add to the rural character of the conservation area, and the narrowing effect. It is in paragraph 5 that the hedgerows add to that, and that the loss of those would be harmful as well.
All right. Now, does that complete everything you had to say about decision core document G15?
There is a conclusion made by the inspector.
Yeah.
that says that the appeal decision doesn't result in enhancing or protecting the appearance of that area.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you mentioned there are other decisions. I don't think we need to go to them in the same detail,
Okay.
because I can put them to the extent that's necessary to Mr. Sutton in due course. But which appeal decisions do you rely on?
There's documents G11, G12, G13 and G14. G11 and G12 were discussing the effects of the same sites before the conservation area was designated, and it was considered even then that it was against the character and appearance of the area. Decisions G13 and G14 are since the conservation area has been designated.
And to what extent do they reflect your case at this inquiry?
They again talk about how the new dwellings would be prominent within the conservation area. They talk about how this alters the conservation area and detracts from the rural character. They also make, and nearly every one of them makes a point of the glimpse views from Windmill Hill and to Windmill Hill are also important.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. That's my examination chief, sir.
Do you want a short break, or do you want to get straight on?
I'm happy to
No,
carry on, I
it's
think.
up to you. If you want
Unless
to,
anybody else wants to, I'm fine to.
because that was shorter than I'd expected.
Yes.
So, yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Is you comfortable?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. Right, you probably aren't comfortable, but okay. But you're happy to carry on.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Garvey, you may now cross-examine the witness, please.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Dr. Hudson Macaulay.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to begin by just making sure I'm clear what are the heritage assets that we're actually concerned with for the appeal. We know there's the St. John's Church.
Yes.
We know there's the conservation area. In the statement of common ground, which I'll read out, the relevant section, this is the planning statement of common ground. It's at page 12. We agree, under the heritage section, that we say, although the appeal scheme lay within the setting of several designated and non-designated heritage assets, such as the Grade 2 listed cottage to the west of the appeal site, other than those that are a point of disagreement, see below, no harm will be occasioned to their heritage significances. And we, the bit that's below is the reference to the church and the conservation area. The reason I ask this is in your proof of evidence, I'll read out the relevant section, you begin to talk about harm to the hedgerow as a non-designated heritage asset, at paragraph 5.14. You say, this will remove them from historic field boundaries and cause harm to this historic landscape and the hedgerows as non-designated heritage assets.
Sorry.
Now, given we have agreed in the statement of common ground, there is no harm to any other heritage assets, either designated or non-designated, other than the church and conservation area, can we agree that you didn't actually intend to say there's going to be harm to the hedgerows as a non-designated heritage asset?
No, the hedgerows as a non-designated heritage asset was something that was raised in comments from the original heritage statement. I picked them up and not realised it's just an error on my part. I was trying to recognise them as non-designated heritage assets, but they weren't for definite. It was a maybe situation. It's just something that I probably should have omitted, and I apologise.
No, that's absolutely fine. Just for the inspector's note, he doesn't need to worry about the hedgerows in his consideration of heritage assets, does he?
Well, he needs to consider them in relation to the conservation area and the what they add to the boundary of the conservation area, but as non-designated as specific non-designated heritage assets as recorded on our HER, no.
Thank you. The degree of harm that you are saying is arised by the development proposal in respect to the church, you say it's at the lower end of the less than substantial bracket?
Yes.
And in respect to the conservation area, you just say it's less than substantial. Would I take that to suggest you saying it's in the mid?
Yes, sorry, it's usually use lower end or upper end, and then less than substantial for middle.
Yeah, that's
or
absolutely...
moderate, whichever way you phrase it.
There's a few points I just want to understand from your evidence. You rely on the site, and you describe the appeal site as being a late medieval enclosed open field.
That isn't my definition. That is what is on our historic landscape classification on our HER.
Yeah, but that's how the inspector should, you say, appreciate it, as a late medieval enclosed open field, because that's how it's identified, as you've indicated.
Yes.
Yeah. What period are we talking about when we're talking about late medieval enclosed open field? Now, to help you, you reference in your appendices, you reference the Avon Historic Landscape Characterization.
Yep.
It's your Appendix 5.
Yes, I've got it.
And for anyone who's following, it's page 18 of the appendices. And you say that that document says that the late medieval enclosed open fields were underway from the 15th century through to the 17th century.
Yes.
So the inspector is meant to think of this field as being indicative of either something between the 15th to 17th century. Is that right?
That was when the field boundaries were laid down. It was in the 15th and 17th century.
I understand. You also make a point about infill plots in the conservation area. I'll read out the relevant paragraph. It's your paragraph 4.1.9. What you say there is you say there are some, just for the note, there are two 4.1.9s. It's the first of the two. You say there are some small infill developments post-1948 within the conservation area, particularly at the eastern end, of the which are generally not in keeping with its historic character, but were included to allow for controls over any further changes. So you're talking about some infill developments at the eastern end of the conservation area, which you're saying were there as a means of control as opposed to them having a contribution to its historic character.
There are some that are there for that purpose, yes.
Yeah, I just want to understand which plots are we talking about?
We're talking about the drive and some development along Hilliers Lane. Hilliers Lane is just towards the east end of the village. And there are also, I can't tell you the exact plot, but there are also two modern developments on the south side of the village that you can see from the sites that are more modern, but I can't tell you the numbers of those houses off the top of my head.
Okay, it'd just be helpful just in a sort of a plan form, if we could perhaps look at the conservation area, where you can roughly talk about where those houses are, roughly, just so I can understand it. I mean, if you want to look at core document F1.
Oh, this is, yeah.
That's the designation.
Yep. I have that.
You've got that?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
on the front page, you can see you've got the conservation area drawn out. I just want to understand where are we talking about those areas of the conservation area that you say don't contribute to its historic character?
We've got development here at Orchard Walk, here at the drive at the top, and then there's a few along Hilliers Lane, which is here, and then there's one or two on this side of the road.
Right.
Here.
Okay. But I understand that you say that they don't contribute to the historic character, but they are not detracting features of the conservation area. Is that correct?
No, I have written in my conservation area and appraisal documents, sorry, I'll just get to it, that there is some unsympathetic development, and those houses, I believe, are both pictured within that area, and Long Orchards, Croft Rise, Hassocks are also considered to be unsympathetic development to the conservation area.
Okay. If I can ask you to turn up Mr. Sutton's proof of evidence, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yep.
And we're going to page 19, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes.
Sorry, actually, if you've got the hard copy, it's page 17, sorry.
Okay. Okay.
What Mr. Sutton does there is he identifies areas that are the late 20th or 21st century examples of development within the village. They're the areas in blue.
Yes.
They aren't the areas you've just identified, are they?
They are similar areas. I have identified B and C, but there are also smaller infill plots. They're not just, these are bigger infill plots that consist of more than one or two houses. There are a few smaller infill plots along that South Road which are modern and not in keeping with the conservation area.
So you didn't identify then, unless I couldn't see it. You weren't identifying the entireties of areas B, C, and A. You were identifying a little bit of B, the very top of C.
No,
and
I've got...
Is that right?
I don't think so, no. They are, for example, they aren't, it does say, for example, the buildings at Front Street, Long Orchard and Cross Rise. They are only an example. I didn't point out every piece of unsympathetic development.
No, I'm asking about the answer you gave me a moment ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I asked you the areas that you say were less sympathetic, and as I understood your answer, you weren't identifying.
No, that's
those...
because you asked to the east of the village. Is that the... Oh, sorry, sorry, it's my fault. The dyslexia is getting the better of me.
Don't worry.
Sorry, I misunderstood east-west. I'm really sorry. It's something I struggle with sometimes. I thought you were asking for the east of the development, which were closer to... Sorry, the west of the development, which is closer to the appeal site, rather than the west side.
Okay. Well, let me cut to the chase. Mr. Sutton says that these are areas which are more modern additions surrounding the conservation area, which don't detract from it. Would you agree with that?
I agree that they're more modern areas. I do feel that they do detract. They are unsympathetic development. If those buildings were to come in and to be designed today, they may have been done differently than when the conservation area was designated. The conservation area boundary doesn't include the entirety of those sites. It does try to keep to the front streets. When you look at C, for example, the majority of that and that modern development isn't in. It's only the fringe buildings at the start. And a few of those sit behind more modern buildings or screening. So they are unsympathetic, but they're not fully included.
So you would therefore state that A, the school, that is an unsympathetic area?
Yes.
Right. And presumably it was unsympathetic to the church then as well?
Yes.
I understand. Okay. The next thing I'd like to understand some of the answers you gave in chief. I was trying to understand your answer about the significance of the conservation area. It's me being slow, but I want to be really clear what you say is the significance of the conservation area. And as I understood you were saying, it's about the village. It's not about the church. And
No.
that's the, let me just ask,
Sorry.
and that's the reason why the church and the northern field of the appeal site had not been included in the conservation area. Did I understand that rightly?
Yeah, the conservation area focuses primarily on the village and the significance of the village. Although the north of the site is not included directly in the conservation area, it is still offered protection from that designation in stance of its setting. But it is designated as a separate asset because it is separate from the church.
Yeah, I'm just focusing on what is the significance of the conservation area that we need to consider could be harmed through the development proposal, because obviously we've got to do this in stages. And I understood that the significance is about the village. And I think you also said it's about the illustrative views you can get towards the built form of Front Street.
Yes, and also the aesthetic value that rural land affords as the natural backdrop to the village. And the experience that you have of that moving through the lanes and footpaths along the village.
I'm going to try and get this down, sorry.
Sorry.
No, it's absolutely fine. It's the village, and by the village, what we mean is the illustrative views of built form along Front Street. Don't let me put words in your mouth. It's not going to be helpful to me or the inspector. I'm just trying to understand what you said. So it's illustrative views of built form along Front Street, and what was the next point you said, sorry?
The aesthetic value of the rural land as the natural backdrop to the village. It's also illustrative of the historic development of the conservation area.
Illustrative of the, sorry, say that again?
The historic development and the hierarchy of the settlement.
Okay, so in terms of the conservation area, they are the three things we're concerned about. It's all about the village, and it's about the village through the illustrative views of the built form along Front Street, the aesthetic value of the rural land as a backdrop to the village, and the illustrative views of the historic development of the settlement. Have I understood that right? That's what we're concerned with about the significance of the conservation area.
It's not the only concern about the significance of the conservation area. A lot of focus in the inquiry has been on that particular part of land, but there are other aspects of the development that harm the conservation area from different viewpoints. You've got the raised table for the highway stream and the lighting that's being put on that. One of the characteristics of the conservation area, as pointed out in my proof and in the conservation area management plan, is how Churchill is a dark village. There isn't street lighting, and you're introducing that into this area, which will harm that rural character and that appearance and appreciation of Front Street.
Right, I'll come back on to effects. I need to absolutely get it, and there's no point of moving on if I don't understand, so I'm trying to be really fair to record what are those aspects which you say are affected. We've got the three. You said, well, that's not everything. You've also said is it the lighting? Is that the other aspect?
Yes, and there's also the loss of the hedgerows to the corner of the junction at the highway table is going to be at. There's a loss of hedgerow there to create a path through the site. And there's also a loss of hedgerow at Front Street, which is one of the issues the inspector had with the Barrowfield application on the adjacent site. The loss of these hedgerows and setback of them removes that.
Sorry, I'm sorry, we're talking about cross purposes. You're talking about the effect of development.
Yes.
Before we get to
Okay,
effects,
I'm sorry.
we've
Yes.
got to understand what's the significance, what is it we're trying to preserve.
Okay.
And only once we understand that,
That's fine.
can we understand. You agree with that as an assessment, only after
Yep, that's
understanding.
fine. Yep. Yeah, I just...
So we'll get on to effects, but in terms of the significance, what was it beyond the three that we listed? Illustrative views of the built form along Front Street, aesthetic value of rural land, and illustrative views of the historic development of the settlement. What was it beyond them in terms of what's
There's
the
associate
significance?
views as well between the conservation area and the church, which you are afforded through the area that's designated in the conservation area and through the setting of both the church and the conservation area.
Those are the four that we're concerned with?
Yes.
Okay. Just that last one that you've added, I'm struggling with that one, because you've told us that the conservation area is not about the church, it's about the village. That being the case, why would views towards the church matter towards the conservation
Because
area?
although the conservation area was designated around the village, that doesn't mean that other assets that you see within the wider scope are not important to the connection. It is set out in somewhere. So, in the Conservation Area and Designation Management Plan, which is core document F6, when looking at conservation areas under views and settings, which I've now re-lost, significance to views and settings can also be to open spaces and church towers. They don't necessarily have to be in the conservation area. They can be within the setting of the conservation area, but they still have significance to the character.
I'm really struggling with that, because if what is significant about the conservation area is the village and not the church, those are your words, then views of the church do not relate to the significance of the conservation area. I totally understand the church as a designated heritage asset in and of itself, we've got to factor in, but you're trying to ally the two when you yourself have said that the church is unrelated to the conservation area, and that's why we excluded the church.
It's not unrelated, it's just, it's not part of the formal character of the village. It's an asset that contributes to the significance of its setting. And it does add associated views between the two, but it is not a formal, you can only really see the church from certain viewpoints from the appeal site and from Front Street, which is through the appeal site. It's not readily seen within the conservation area. But that doesn't, where you can see it, it contributes to the understanding of the historic development of the village away from the church.
Okay. I'm going to try and agree some points of principle. The purpose of the conservation area is to preserve and enhance the special character of the area.
Yes.
And we are trying to protect areas of special architectural or historic interest.
Yes.
Insofar as the site is concerned, am I right in saying it's not architectural interest, it's historic interest we're focused on?
Well, it has some historic interest. No, not architecture. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so we're not,
Yes.
as far as the site's concerned, architectural interest doesn't come into the...
Well, that's not true, because architectural interest does come from what you can see in the buildings and the architectural value of those buildings that you can see from the site. That does have, you can see those architectural features, which has interest. But there's no physical building in the area.
Yeah, well, we agree, though, that we don't harm the architectural interest of any other building, do we?
Not of the buildings, no, but of the viewpoints towards the buildings, which you can appreciate the architectural interest. You do in some ways.
I'm afraid I don't understand that. You either do or you don't affect the architectural interest of other buildings.
You don't affect the...
Let me ask the question.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I thought we'd agreed that in terms of the heritage assets we're concerned with, and in terms of non-designated heritage assets, it's only the conservation area and the church.
Yes.
Nothing else is affected.
No.
Therefore, the architectural interest of any other building, when you're stood on the site, is presumably not harmed when you're looking towards the conservation area.
But they're in the conservation area. But you're not, I understand if you're trying to say that you're not physically affecting the architectural interest, you're not physically affecting the architectural interest of any of the buildings, no.
Right, and we know we're not affecting the architectural interest of any other heritage asset that you can see.
No.
Right, so what is it that, what architectural...
Well, actually, that's not correct. Sorry, I must correct myself. You are affecting the architectural, the visual interest where you can see the architectural features of the church, but you're not physically harming those features.
Well, I put the church to one side,
Okay.
we'll come to that. I'm talking about any other building. I'm trying to understand...
Right there, that's fine.
What specific building are you eroding the architectural interest of from the conservation area,
Well,
from the site?
You'll block views through to Barrow Cottage, which admittedly some of them are seasonal, and view to the copula sites of the belt. It's not a bell tower, it's a copula of Sydney Hills Cottages, which has architectural interest, which you won't be able to see through the housing and the screening elements within the conservation area.
Barrow Cottage and Copley.
And you'll also affect they're more 20th century, but you will also lose viewpoints to the two buildings that are also visible from that site that are quite unique architectural styling that are next to Barrow Cottage.
Right, so you'll affect the architectural interest of Barra Cottage, 2 buildings next to it, and the Copler, you said?
Yeah, there's a copula on top of Sydney Hill cottages that you can see through some viewpoints of the site.
Right, and we agree, I presume, that none of them are designated or non-designated heritage assets?
Sydney Cottages is a Grade 2 listed building.
Right, but we don't compromise its architectural
No.
interest? Right. Sorry, Sydney Cottage, what's that, sorry? Is the copula around Sydney Cottage?
It's Sydney Cottages is a brick-built building. It's quite large, Grade 2. It's a series of what I think is almshouses in that area, and there's a copula that sits on top of the roof point of the middle of Sydney Cottages.
Right. So is the copula part of Sydney Cottages?
Yes.
Right. We don't compromise the architectural interest of Sydney Cottages, do we?
Not physically, but losing that viewpoint, you lose that view of the copula from that distant view from the conservation area, which in a way affects its architectural interest.
I'm sorry. We can't bring in other heritage assets now.
No, sorry.
So I'm hoping we can agree.
You can't, yeah, you don't physically affect that building, no.
Yeah, okay. So the architectural interest of the copula isn't affected. We're left with Barra Cottage and the 2 buildings next to it.
Yes.
And we agree they are not heritage assets in themselves.
I'm not certain on Barrow Cottage. It might be a non-designated heritage asset, but no, I don't think so.
Okay. Right, well, I'll pick that up with Mr. Sutton. If it's not a designated heritage asset, i.e. it's a non-designated...
Oh, yes, and not a designated heritage asset, no.
So in terms of the architectural interest we're protecting from the site, it's Barra Cottage and the 2 buildings next to it. In terms of, the rest, it's historic interest.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The next point I wanted to ask you about is conservation areas. They don't exist to prevent development. You acknowledge that in the Conservation Area Management Plan.
Yes.
What they do is to ensure that we preserve what is special about the conservation area.
Yes.
To be able to conduct that exercise, we have to first understand what is historically special about the appeal site, or how the appeal site can contribute to other heritage assets. You'd agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Rarity is relevant to heritage significance, isn't it?
Yes, it is one of the aspects.
Yeah. Because as a matter of principle, what is commonly found is less likely to be valued in heritage terms as opposed to what is less commonly found.
Yes, you can say that about anything, but yeah.
Yeah. That's what makes something special, that it's
Yeah.
less common, yeah. And of course, across a conservation area, there'll be varying degrees of historical and architectural interest.
Yes.
Yeah. And we know that this site, on your view, is next to one of the detracting aspects of the conservation area being next to the school.
Yes.
Yeah. The statutory protection offered to a conservation area is to land within it. I know there's protection offered by the NPPF, but the statutory protection offered by Section 72 of the Act is to land within it, not its setting. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, it relates to land within the conservation area. It's
Yeah.
designated under 69.
So
Okay.
when it's being designated, that statutory protection is deliberately being offered to that land within it, unlike Section 66 of the Act, which is protecting the listed building and its setting.
Yes.
Yeah. When we are talking about setting of a heritage asset, we are concerned with how the development, how the significance of the heritage asset will be affected by development within its setting.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, of course, it was a clumsy question. We're not concerned with the significance of the setting, are we? We're concerned with the significance of the asset.
Under the law, we're not concerned with the significance of the asset, but under the policy, we are concerned with the significance of the setting.
Well, you don't protect the setting in and of itself. You protect the setting insofar as that setting can contribute towards the significance.
Yes.
Yeah. The setting doesn't have its own significance. It's the heritage asset itself which has that
Oh,
significance.
yes, sorry, yes.
Yeah. And you're trying to consider how does that setting impact upon the significance of that
Yes.
asset. Yeah. A few facts about the church. It was built in the 13th century.
Yes.
We had additions to it in the 14th century.
Actually, I think it's listed as being the 12th century origin.
Right. And then we had some additions to it in the 14th century.
14th century and the 15th century, and then there was a restoration in 1876-ish. I've got the list description here, I can find that for you.
I'll take your word for it, 1876. In terms of where the significance of the church is appreciated, you'd agree that it's inside the courtyard is where the setting and significance is most appreciated?
The more intimate views that hold a higher significance are within the courtyards. But that is not limited. As you move away from the church, those views become less significant, but that doesn't mean that they're not important.
Okay. Its architectural interest from the appeal site, you can't actually appreciate its architectural interest. What you can get the sense of, it's a landmark. You get the sense that it's old, but it's only when you get closer do you really understand its architectural interest. Is that fair?
No, I think you can appreciate the architectural interest from the site. You can see quite a lot of detailing in the towers. You can see the finicles, you can see the Gothic windows, you can see the turret, the small, I don't know if turret's the right word, but the small turret with the crenellations on the top. You can see the gabled ends of the church from some of the views from the site. Obviously more distant views, you see generally more of the tower, but you can appreciate that architectural and those details from those views.
Right. I'm going to ask you something about the church as a focal point. In your proof of evidence, bear with me, I'll get it up. It's at paragraph 4.2.5, you talk about churches were designed to be dominant features within a particular landscape, a high status building with a high architectural value. This church wasn't designed to be that focal point, or at least it didn't serve that focal point, did it?
It was designed to be a focal point. Most churches are. They're the most, they're usually the most visible, prominent structures within a community. They're designed to be prominent, so they are visible to that community.
But you go on to say that it is believed that the original settlement of Churchill, this is at paragraph 4.2.8.
Yeah.
You say, it is believed the original settlement of Churchill was located north of the church, which is supported by the presence of earthwork remains. You then give us a quote from your Appendix 4.
Yes.
I've gone to your Appendix 4, and I can pick this up with Mr. Sutton, but Appendix 4, it gives us an extract from 2 pages of a book. I'm not sure it's worthwhile me reading both pages out, but those pages relate to they don't relate to Churchill at all.
They do relate to Churchill in as it says in paragraph, 4.2.7. Oh, hang on, is that the right one? 4.2.7, where it says that logically the church is at the center of a village. However, some villages, in this case, like the example at Churchill, there's been a reason why that has now, that core settlement has moved, and this usually implies a change to the settlement in that past.
I think there's an error here because the quotation you've given us doesn't align itself with the extract of the book you've given us.
That shouldn't. The bit that's as with Churchill, that's what I'm saying. Sorry, that shouldn't be in italics. It should be.
Right. Okay.
I'm trying to relate that paragraph to it. That book doesn't specifically talk about Churchill. It talks about those type of settlements and what they mean. It is just a formatting error.
No, that's absolutely
if
fine.
that's the issue that you have with that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful because that was Appendix 4 is talking about broad assessments of churches. It's not talking about Churchill at all.
It doesn't relate. How do I phrase this correctly?
Let me put it this way, see if I can help you. You have used a guidance to inform your judgment that that there was a development around the church at first?
Yes, that book and also the archaeological information within the HER.
Yeah, but we have no evidence before this inquiry that the settlement of Churchill ever grew around this church.
You should have done, because your heritage consultant would have done a HER search, which would have brought out the same information base that I've used.
Okay, Mr. Sutton, he can speak about his impression. I'm trying to understand what is the evidence before the inquiry that Churchill at any stage was focused on the church and building around the church as a focal point.
Well, there's evidence in our HER that shows.
Do I have that?
It's an online resource.
Okay, so in terms of evidence before the inquiry, because that's my job to go through the evidence that's brought in front of the inspector, because the evidence from your proof referred me to Appendix 4. We've established that that was an error. Trying to understand what is the evidence before the inquiry that Churchill ever grew around the church.
I don't really know what you mean. Sorry, I don't quite understand.
Are you able to take me to anywhere within the proof of evidence or the core documents or anywhere that gives me the evidence beyond your impression that Churchill did grow around this church as a focal point?
Well, in my proof, I have related to in paragraph 4.28 of my proof.
That's what we've just discussed, which is your Appendix 4. Which...
No, it also says that's 4.2.7. 4.2.8 says that it's believed the historical settlement of Churchill was located to the north, which is supported by the presence of earthwork remains. It's in the proof.
Yeah, I've seen that. The presence of earthwork remains, what is the inspector or I meant to take from that gives us the evidence? I don't have any earthwork remains. That's in evidence. Is that the inspector goes to site and he forms his impression?
It's either that or we do have those earthworks recorded on our HER. I can print off a monument records that relates to those earthworks, if that would be helpful.
I'm not inviting new evidence. I'm trying to understand what evidence we've got of this. And if it's 4.2.8, that's fine.
Okay.
That answers my question. Okay, so putting to one side as to whether Churchill ever did grow around the church at any previous point, we agree that it hasn't grown around Churchill historically.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, sorry, that Churchill hasn't grown around St. John's Church
You
as a
mean
focal point.
Churchill Conservation Area?
Churchill as a settlement?
Oh, Churchill as a settlement, no.
Yeah.
Not historically, and there are some modern, the school site is relatively near, but Churchill as a historic settlement hasn't grown up around the church.
Yeah, because there are a lot of settlements where you will go to them and you've got the church in the middle and the spire, and you know that the settlement has just grown organically from there.
Yes, that's something that Mr. Sutton relates to in his proof.
Yeah, and in those circumstances, the church can be the landmark because it's the focal point of the settlement, and you know that the settlement has grown up around that. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, but that isn't the situation that we have here. The church doesn't act as a landmark or a focal point to this settlement.
It does act as a focal point to this settlement, although the bigger settlement is, there are buildings around the church representative of the historic settlement there. You've got the court and you've got the cottages. And it does act as a landmark to the village, because even though the village moved away, the footpath on the historic maps that you can see that are in the appendix of my proof, you can see that footpath that's deliberately through to the church, which would suggest that the community still went to that church and used that footpath. It may have decided to move physically away, but it wasn't completely disconnected, and it was still used as part of the community. Otherwise, the church would have failed by now.
Okay. That's a point I'll pick up with Mr. Sutton. The next point, in your proof of evidence, you, 4.2.14 You're talking to us about the setting of the church and the views towards this designated heritage asset add to its significance as it forms part of the area in which you can appreciate its architectural significance and understand its placement within the settlement and wider landscape. Although these views play a slightly less significant role in the church's significance in comparison to those closer to the church and around the churchyard, they nonetheless form part of the building setting, which adds to its overall significance.
Yeah.
It's that use of slightly less. You're telling us that the views from the appeal site are slightly less significant than views standing in the churchyard. That can't be right, can it?
Well, that is right. They are slightly less significant than those standing in the churchyard.
They're significantly less significant, aren't they? It's the immediate setting of the church is where
I see, you're picking up on
is where one experiences the architectural and historic significance of the church. It's not from the appeal site, and it would be wrong to suggest it's slightly less significant.
I do agree that they are less significant than those on the church. I don't agree that they are not significant at all. I do think they are less than what you get from the churchyards. But no, I agree that they are less significant.
They're not slightly less, they're significantly less significant.
I'm not sure I would say they were significantly less significant, but they are not as significant as those from inside the churchyards.
Okay, I'm going to go back to an answer you gave us earlier about the significance of the conservation area. Do you recall that we went through what the 4 points were? It was illustrative views of the built form along Front Street. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
And I think what we've got to about that is it's the Barrack Cottage and the 2 buildings next to it. That's what we're talking about as far as the appeal site contributes to that illustrative view.
Yes.
Yep. The next point is the aesthetic value of the rural land. Now, am I right in saying that the aesthetic value is derived from this being a preserved late medieval field? Is that right?
It's not just that, it's also the natural backdrop of the conservation area and the appreciation of that. The aesthetic value, I mean, the field is preserved, but there are obviously modern interventions that cut across that, and there are changes to the Front Street boundary as well. But it isn't just related to your point. It was more the aesthetic value is also associated with the rural land there.
Trying to understand it in heritage terms, what's the heritage significance of the aesthetic value?
That it provides the natural, the rural backdrop to the village.
Yeah, you could have a village built today, right now, that has a rural backdrop that doesn't have any heritage significance. So I'm trying to understand what's the heritage significance of that rural backdrop. As I understood your evidence, it was that this rural backdrop is a preserved rural backdrop. That's its historic significance, not its landscape, its historic significance.
Yeah, it is a preserved field boundary, but it's also has significance for the appreciation of the village as it sits in the landscape, which gives it significance. You can understand how the heritage has, how the village has moved from that historic development from the core out through to the site here, where it thins out and it comes into the more rural land that sits behind it. The appreciation of that semi-rural character as part of the significance of the conservation area is not an opinion I hold on my own. The other inspectors have a...
We'll come on to the other appeal decisions. I'm trying to drill down exactly what are the components here. So the aesthetic value of the rural land is as the backdrop of the village. I understood that is because we're preserving the field boundary and we're preserving that historic backdrop. And then you talked about the illustrative views of the historic development, which is, as I understand it, you can understand how the settlement has expanded out. Is that the point you're making?
Yes.
And I'm really not trying to put words in your mouth, I'm just trying to understand it.
The point I'm making is that offers that rural backdrop and the glimpse views from the conservation area through to that land, which adds to the character of the village itself.
Right, so what I'm going to write down as I'm hoping a fair summary of what we've got to, the significance of the conservation area is its illustrative views of the built form along Front Street, which we now know to be Barrow Cottage and the two buildings. That's point number one.
The illustrative views also include Sydney Cottage Copula as well.
But we know that the development proposal doesn't cause any harm to them, so we need not concern ourselves with those.
Well, they cause harm to the viewpoints. They don't cause harm to the building itself.
I don't understand the difference, sorry.
Well,
The inspector need not concern themselves with any harm to Sydney Cottage, because it's not one of the designated heritage assets we're worried about.
no, it's more harm to the conservation area as you lose some aspects of the views of the development of the town.
Okay, but you don't have any harmful views of that heritage asset, do you? Of Sydney Cottage. The views of Sydney Cottage that you currently enjoy are not compromised, because if they were, that would be another heritage asset that we'd have to worry about.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so going back to my list, it's the illustrative views of the built form along Front Street, which we now know to be Barrow Cottage and the two buildings associated with it. That's point number one. It's the aesthetic value of the rural land as a backdrop to the village, because this is a preserved field. And number three, it's the illustrative views of the historic development of the settlement in terms of appreciation of how the settlement has grown out. And number four, it's the associated views towards the church.
Yes, I don't know whether you've got in your notes as well that it's also the experience that you get through that area that adds to its significance, which adds aesthetic value. I guess it would come under aesthetic value.
Yeah, because
I didn't hear that answer. Could you just speak up?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that it was associated with the aesthetic value of the experience that you get moving through that site as a person. Adds to its significance, but it would probably likely come under aesthetic value.
yeah, but as we agreed, it's not just aesthetic value for aesthetic value's sake. It's got to be in the context of its historic aesthetic value, and you were relating that to the fact that you're experiencing a preserved field.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. We've got those 4 points. The built form, I'll pick up with Mr. Sutton. The preserved field. That point I want to understand. Now you say that it's a well-preserved late medieval field, and you rely on it having historic field boundaries, which you tell us at paragraph 3.1.3. You say that the site is divided into 3 fields by mature native hedgerows, which follows the historic field boundaries by some post and rail fencing.
Yes.
I'm trying to understand the historic preserved aspect of it, and you also tell us that it's remained an open green land since it was first depicted.
Yes, on the tithe maps.
And you tell us at paragraph 5.10 that it's not merely agricultural land, but undeveloped countryside which has little change from the late medieval period. First point I'd like to make under this idea of it being a preserved field, if we look at Appendix 5 to your evidence, please.
Yes, 1 second. Okay.
Appendix 5 is the Avon Historic Landscape Characterization. It's page 14 of your appendices, for anyone who's following. It tells us at the outset that the character of the historic landscape of the county, both rural and urban, has been surveyed by the identification and adoption of a series of historic landscape categories or types. It then has 2 bullet points, and in the next paragraph I'll read out, it talks about the historic landscape categorization is therefore a survey of the existing visible landscape rather than a recreation of pre-existing landscapes. For the present, this is the key point, it says there are 32 categories have been identified, defined more fully below, and arranged into 12 groups which can be briefly itemized as, and then under Group A, you've got common field systems. Now, as I understand this, the intention behind this is to group together various different types of historic landscape categories. And the first one, under all these 32 categories is common field systems. Yes?
Yes.
And if we jump forward
Yes.
a few pages to Group A, which is page 18 of the appendices, on page 18, Group A, A1, late medieval enclosed open fields created by local arrangement and exchange. And then we see under the first sentence that this is probably the category most commonly found in the county. So
Yes.
Pausing there, this field, as a late medieval enclosed open field, is the most common historic landscape one can find in the county. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, according to this document.
Yeah. So necessarily we agreed how special something is related to how rare and how common it is. So it being the most common thing we can find, historic landscape, it is by virtue the least valuable.
It's less valuable. It doesn't mean it's not valuable.
Yeah, okay, I agree with that. The next point is how much it's been preserved, because you say there's been little change, and you actually refer to it as being a fossilized. At 511 of your proof, you refer to it as being a fossilized historic landscape. I want to explore that. So to do that, in your appendices, I'm going to ask you to go to page 4, which is the tithe map and the ordnance map, please. And to do this exercise we're about to do, you're going to have the site layout.
Okay, I don't have that.
Or I'm using the site layout. There's plenty of plans of the site, but I'm using H1.
I don't have a copy of this site layout.
Have you? Well, I should be looking at the same thing as you. Have you got a document which has the site on it now? If you don't, could someone provide the witness with H1?
I've got one that shows the conservation area where you can see where the site is.
I'd like it to be a little bit finer grain. Thank you so much.
I might have it in... Is it in the Statement of Common Ground at all?
I doubt it, but I think it.
Oh, okay.
Document we're looking at.
Looking at H1.
Oh, God. That's electric.
H1.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do you need, just conscious you've got no water now, do you need a moment? We have been going a while.
No, it's okay. I'll just pour it in and try not to get it everywhere.
Have you got some more water? Okay.
Yes.
Looking at, so what we've got on the one hand is the tithe map and the first ordnance map survey. That's from your proof.
Yeah.
And then next to it, you've got the site location plan, which is H1.
Yes.
Okay. So we can see from the tithe map, what we're going to do is try and compare and contrast, because you say that this is a fossilized, preserved, late medieval field, and we're going to explore whether that's accurate. So you can see on the tithe map, you've got 207. Can you see
Yes.
that? But if you follow the boundary of that site, the northern boundary, you can see that it doesn't follow the appeals site. There's actually a whole portion that's been cut off near the church. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. So in terms of these being a preserved medieval field, we know that the boundaries have changed, yes?
They have changed slightly, yes, but you've still got the portion at 206 in the west corner and the field boundary that runs along Church Lane, but there are differences.
Yeah. You don't acknowledge that in your evidence, do you?
I don't think so.
In fact, 206 is still there, but actually if we look to the southern aspect of the site, that's been eroded as well, hasn't it? in terms of the boundary of the site?
I don't think so, no.
So you say that if we go to the site now, it reads as 2 fields as it did in 1840, 207 and 206. That's what we'd see.
Well, you can still see 206, and it still has, I'm pretty certain it, hang on 1 second, I haven't got an aerial for, I'm not 100% sure without going out on site whether or not the field boundary to 206 at the top is still there.
It is. The
Yeah.
boundary to the boundary to 206, but you've also got an additional boundary now next to 206 that breaks up the field even further.
By Barra Cottage.
Correct. Let me see if I can get you a better photograph of the site. Yeah, we can probably do the design and access statement if you've got that.
What number is the design and access statement?
It's core document C2. I'm so sorry to get you up again.
I only have D's. I think Natalie's just going to grab it for me. Oh, I'm going to lose that now. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. If you go into that document, perhaps page 18 would do it, please.
Sorry, it's a bit unwieldy.
Don't worry, take your time.
Okay.
You all set?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you look at that page, which you can see existing hedgerow, which is to be retained,
Yes.
you can see that actually, if you go back to the tithe map,
Yep.
there's almost a line that follows 206 all the way across to 204, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. So we can see that actually the northern boundary has come down, the southern boundary has come up almost entirely, and we also know, looking at the tithe map again, the site is there split into 2, as 207, 206, but we now know that the site is comprised of 3 fields.
Yes, there is a more modern boundary that runs,
Yeah.
but it isn't. It is a post and rail fence.
Yeah. You refer to it in your proof of evidence as a historic boundary, though you say there are 3 fields divided by historic boundaries, but actually that's not right, is there? The historic boundary was only between 207 and 206.
Yeah, that must be an error on my part.
And just to be fair to you, that historic boundary that you reference is paragraph 3.1.3.
Okay.
So Mr. Leader can track that. There's also a distinction in respect to how it's changed that there's a public right-of-way that's no longer there. Because if you look at the ordnance map...
The 1888.
Yes,
Yep.
thank you. Can you see there that there's 2 rights-of-way that get cut diagonally across the site?
Yes.
And now we know that one of those public rights-of-way has gone.
Yes.
And for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not talking about the rights-of-way which is technically still meant to be across the site. I'm talking about the fact that there are 2 shown on this ordnance map, and we now know there would only be 1. We also know that there's a menage now across the site, where there's no suggestion that that would have been present in 1840 or 1888.
Yes.
We also know now that anyone who is traversing that site is going to be seeing the the school, which you describe as being a detracting factor for both the church and the conservation area.
You won't get views of the school from every point of that footpath, but you do get some views to the school.
Yeah. And we also know now that in terms of appreciation of the church, you've got in the foreground of the church 2 16th century cottages.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think they're 16th century.
Yeah. So in terms of this being a well-preserved, fossilized field, as a matter of fact, it's not, because we can see the field that existed in 1840 is not there. What you've got, at best, is remnants of a historic field.
I wouldn't say that it was remnants. A very large part of that field is still there, and the field at 206 is also still there. There has been erosions to the north and to the south, as you've pointed out, but there's still a large part of that field is still present.
Yeah, well, putting it crudely, if I got in my time machine now and I went back to 1840 and I looked around, I'd say, well, what's happened to my field? I've lost the northern boundary, I've lost the southern boundary, it's been split into 3, there's a modern school there. It would be glaringly different and far from it being a fossilized.
I wouldn't say it was
late medieval
glaringly
field.
different. There are differences, but you still can see the open land that is part of that field and the field boundaries that are running along Church Lane and the 206 and Front Street. There are differences.
And it's fair to say that in your proof of evidence, you don't address any of these differences, do you?
I haven't, not that I'm aware of, no.
So what we agreed is that this field is one of the most common fields, is the most common field that you can find in the county, and this is ultimately a bad example of one in historical terms, because it has substantially changed since 1840.
I wouldn't say it was substantially changed. It has been altered, and even then it's not a, sorry, it hasn't been substantially changed. I mean, there has been changes to the boundaries, but I wouldn't say it was the complete erosion of that. Sorry, it's at the
Sorry?
top. Oh, it's
it's
there's
somebody
a
upstairs.
meeting room at the top there.
Sorry.
Sorry, sir.
I thought somebody was interjecting there. I do forgive me.
So I've got more questions. I don't have a huge amount more, but I'm conscious it's 4 o'clock. The witness has been going since 2:30. I'm entirely relaxed to keep going. I'm just trying to think about
How
when.
much longer do you think?
I suspect I've got another 45 minutes, perhaps, sir.
All right. I think probably worth having a break if you want.
Sure, I don't mind either way.
Take a breath.
Yep.
You obviously need to keep yourself separate from your team and
Okay.
sort of isolated. You can't discuss the case at all while you're on the witness
Okay.
table. Okay.
Yep.
Obviously, you can leave to go to the toilet or whatever, but you just can't discuss the case. All
Okay.
right. But so we'll adjourn for 15 minutes, and we'll come back at 4:15. 4:15. So inquiry is resumed. Remember to turn your microphone on if it's not. No, are you okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Right, okay. Right, so Mr. Garvey, if I ask you to pick up where you left off with the cross-examination, please.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon again.
Good afternoon.
Where we're getting to in terms of the significance of the conservation area, you'll recall we had the 4 points. The first one was the illustrative built form along Front Street, which is the Barrow Cottage and 2 buildings. We were just closing off on the second point, which is the aesthetic value of the rural land being a preserved field. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And we went through various ways in which this is not actually a preserved field, and it's not fossilised. And I think you acknowledged there was a number of points that you hadn't appreciated about how the field has changed. Is that fair?
That's fair, but I also don't agree that it doesn't have, although it's been eroded, I don't agree that it's lost all of its character.
Okay, fair. It's eroded in a way that you hadn't appreciated. That must decrease the significance of the appeal site. It must do.
Not really. I mean, it's still a significant area of rural backdrop that's aesthetically pleasing to that conservation area.
Yeah, but we're concerned with historic interest, and you had said it's got historic interest as a preserved field, that it's been fossilised. But actually we've discovered it's not been fossilised, it's been substantially changed. That being the case, that must change your assessment of how much historic value it's got.
Well, historic value doesn't, it hasn't been, its historic value hasn't been completely eroded. It may have a slight, in specifically historic detailing, might have a slightly less significance, but it's not slightly less to other values of the area. Aesthetic values of the area.
So I didn't understand that. I'm going to have to keep pressing on this. Your evidence previously, the reason why you were finding that there's moderate, less than substantial harm to the conservation area was because of your appreciation of the significance of the appeal site and its contribution to the conservation area. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. You had made an assessment about what is the significance of the appeal site.
Yes.
One of those factors is that this is a preserved, fossilised field.
Yes.
Yeah. But we now know that it's not a preserved, fossilised field. It's changed in ways that you hadn't appreciated.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. And whilst you say it's not completely lost all of its heritage significance, it must have less heritage significance because of that change.
On that one point,
Yeah.
yes.
And that must necessarily reduce the extent to which the development of the appeal site will cause any harm to the conservation area. It has to.
Slightly, but not. I wouldn't change it to that the appeal site would be lower end and less than substantial. I would still say on the whole it would be less than substantial harm.
Yeah.
On all the factors, not just that one point.
Okay. Well, that's 2 points in which it contributes to significance. The third point is about how the settlement has grown. Do you recall we went through the ways in which the appeal site contributes to significance, and that was the third point?
Yes.
Yeah. And you said that the appeal site provides illustrative views of the historic development of the settlement. On this point, I'm struggling because at one point in your evidence, you were saying, well, the appeal site demonstrates how the settlement has grown away from the church. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And then when I pushed you and said that the church isn't a focal point, it's not a landmark in that respect, you said it is the focal point.
It is a focal point.
Can you help me reconcile those 2 points?
Well, it's the opposite way round. What you're seeing from the appeal site is the moving of the village out from the core. The core is to the west, so you're seeing that hierarchy from the west filter out. Hang on. east, filter out to the west, where you can see how the relationship of how it changes the transformation from the rural into the built form. You're just seeing it from a different viewpoint from that appeal site than what you would see from Front Street itself.
I'm really struggling to understand your answer, so I'm going to have to keep pressing until it makes sense to me, and it might not make sense to me, but I'm going to have to keep asking. You're saying that you were saying that the church is not the focal point. Oh, so you were saying the church is the focal point of the settlement?
Oh, no, so the church is a focal point in the landscape and in associated views through the site. It is not the focal point of the conservation area.
Okay. In terms of how the site tells us about the historic development of the settlement, tell me, how does it, if I go to the site now, how do I learn about how Churchill has grown?
Well, you can see from the site that you've got the historic buildings that have the bigger plot size, and this is characteristic of core settlements where the hierarchy of streets tend to be the busier, more the commerce sort of centres. The busier areas of the town are usually focused in the centre, but with Front Street it's focused on the east side, and how that's filtered out along Windmill Hill to this site where you've got bigger plot sizes, which then shows that transitional period of those buildings that filter out into the countryside or into the more rural bit of the conservation area, which is Barrowfields.
Okay, so what I'm taking from that is I'm seeing the historic buildings from the appeal site, and that tells me about how the settlement's grown out. Is that right?
You're seeing the historic buildings, and they're kind of the plot sizes and the spaces between those buildings, which are larger and more representative of quieter development and less of the hierarchy of the busier area elements towards the core of the centre.
But from the appeal site, we've agreed it's only Barrow Cottage and the two buildings that I'm really having appreciation of. From the appeal side, I don't get any of that.
I disagree. I think you can see that the fact that the two other buildings are an infill, you can see rooftops across the road, and you can see that that is a gap between the building line along the Front Street.
Sorry, as I'm on the appeal site,
yeah.
You've told us that the built form that I'm appreciating is Barrow Cottage and the two buildings surrounding it.
Yes.
You're also saying, well, I can get an understanding of how the settlement has grown out. What is it I'm specifically looking at this point?
You're looking at the Barrowfields and then the infill development that is right next to it, which is, I think it's 20th century architecture, which has been infilled in between Barrowfield and the historic town.
So I'm looking at, perhaps on a plan form, you can show me what buildings you say that I'm looking at.
Sure. If you look at the, I guess it'd be easiest to do the design and access statement.
Is it being put to the witness, and it may be the witness's fault, but I just want to be clear what case is being put in light of Mr. Cook's evidence earlier, that you could only see 3 properties from the appeal side, because that might be the cause of some of the confusion that's going on. I'm not saying that you are or you're not, but it seems as if you're putting it, and if that is what you're putting, that doesn't appear to be consistent with what Mr. Cook said earlier, and I'm getting confused. I want to know what case is being put to my witness, because earlier Mr. Cook's evidence was, and I thought I understood it to be, that you could see quite a lot of development on the appeal side. It's now being put that you can see 3 properties. It may be that's because the witness has said it, or it may be that it's being put that way, but I'm just confused. What's being put?
I'd be interested to know where this sort of heading, what conclusion you're trying to draw from it, bearing in mind that I will go and stand and look at all these viewpoints as well.
So this witness has identified 4 aspects that she says the appeal site contributes to significance. We say this appeal site doesn't contribute, but I need to understand what are the elements that I need to close on. We've gone through 2 of them in some detail, in the Barrow Cottage and the preserved field. We're now trying to understand what it is that she's inviting you to look at, so whilst on site, that lets you understand this historic development of the settlement. I'm not saying you can't see any buildings. I'm trying to understand what are the buildings that she references, because it's not in her proof. That's it, sir, because I can't in any way understand her evidence. If she just says, I can see a building, that doesn't help you or us. So I'm simply trying to understand what are the buildings.
So which are the buildings then that you were specifically thinking of?
If you go to the design and access statement, since it's probably the easiest one that everyone's already looked at, you've got, oh, sorry, it's 18.
It's C2.
I think it's, isn't it C2?
That's what I said, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said C6, I don't know why. 18.
So the question that you were going to respond to is, what are the buildings that you invite the inspector to look at that's going to tell the inspector about what you say is the historic development of the settlement that you can appreciate from the appeal site?
There is, they run here. So there's one here, which is Barrow Cottage.
Yep.
And then there's these 2 here,
Yeah.
which is next to Barrow Cottage. And you can see some element of this one across the road here.
Would you take my approach just so I can see?
No,
what she-
it's fine.
So was that those 4 properties on the north side of the front street? Is that right?
There's 3 on the north, and there's this one, I think you can see this one, I'm trying to point it out on the south, that's between the 2.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we've gone through those 3 elements. I understand the areas that you're saying are contributing to the significance of the conservation area in this location. I was asking you earlier that your appreciation now that this is not a fossilised field and it has been eroded, the degree to which you disagree with Mr. Sutton, but it has been eroded, I put to you that must decrease the historic interest and its historic significance of the appeal site. Do you therefore agree that this is at less than your original assessment of moderate, less than substantial, and it would be going down to at least the lower end of less than substantial?
No, I don't think that it would be enough to push it down to the lower end of less than substantial.
Would it now be moderate to lower?
No, I still think it would be, because I still think it would be moderate, less than substantial harm for the development as a whole in that area.
I'm struggling to understand how your view can remain intact and unchanged when we realise that the fossilised preserved field, as you understood it, is not a fossilised preserved field.
Well, it's not just that aspect that makes the conservation area.
The other aspects that we've looked at are the views that you can appreciate of Barrow Cottage and the 2 buildings and the few buildings that you've had there. In reality, the development proposal is going to have a very limited impact on those buildings, isn't it?
It's still going to have an impact on views towards those buildings.
It's going to have in historical terms, these aren't design views. Do you agree?
No, there are no designed views.
These aren't particularly significant heritage assets in themselves. Barrow Cottage.
They're
and
not
Toogood.
designated heritage assets, no.
Yeah, nor are they non-designated.
I'm not 100% sure on Barrow Cottage, but the other two are not, no.
Okay, well, so in terms of historic interest, the fact that you potentially the view of any roofs of these buildings might be compromised isn't going to have much of an effect, is it?
We're still going to have an effect.
In my question, it's not going to have much of an effect. I'm trying to understand where you get to the moderate less than substantial.
I think that the other aspects of the site still cause harm that would result to moderate, less than substantial harm.
Okay. Views of the church that you rely upon, you rely on a view through the gate, which you provide us in your proof of evidence as viewpoint 8.
Yes, it's viewpoint 8.
Let's look at that, if you would, please.
Yeah, of course. Just find it a second.
Have you got that?
Yes.
Okay. So this view across the of the church, it's only a winter view, isn't it?
It's a seasonal view, yes.
Yeah. In terms of lighting, this is going to be a unlit view. So in terms of winter, you're not going to see it while it's dark, are you?
I'd need to confirm if there's any lighting on the church itself. Some of them have lighting. Lighting, I'm not sure if this one does, but in general, no.
Yep.
Until I find out that point.
At this point, this is not a view of a landmark, is it?
Well, I would disagree. It's still a landmark view of that building, and it's a pleasant view of that building, as Mr. Cook attests to as well. There is a nice view along from that site to that church.
Help me understand to what extent that view could not be retained through the development proposal.
Well, in the current circumstance, it's not retained. There are buildings suggested on that area as well as a wider access. And given the height of the land in relation to the pavement of Front Street, the land is elevated. So currently, the housing through there that's on that field is going to block those views.
Okay. I'll pick that up with Mr. Sutton. Are you suggesting that you can appreciate the architectural interest of the church from this view?
You could if the photograph was a bit better. When you're stood there, you can see the crenellated Gothic tower to the church, and you can also see the finnacles and tracery at the top and of the church.
Okay. The next point I've got for you in your proof of evidence, these are views ultimately that the inspector will see on site. So there's little point as forensically saying you can and you can't see it. The inspector will figure that out very quickly. But I want to ask you what you say about views of the church approaching Front Street. In your proof of evidence, you say that currently the views of the church and its position in the landscape can be experienced across the appeal site. You say approaching the village from Front Street and from the public right-of-way which runs through the appeal site. Trying to understand, as you're approaching the village of Front Street,
Yes,
what is the view of the church that will in any way be affected?
it's that view here. I guess approaching might have been on Front Street from where Church Lane moves into Front Street.
So when you say what you meant is when you're leaving the village.
Oh, it depends on which way you're going. Oh, no, hang on. No, yes, okay, sorry.
Yeah, because
yes.
obviously if you're walking towards the village, your back's towards the church, so
Yes.
it's not going to be affected. The only view is when you're walking out of the village. Yeah, and it's that gate view that you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay. Relationship between the listed building and the site. I'm right in thinking that there is no evidence that there was ever any ownership or common ownership between the appeal site and the church?
Not that I'm aware of, and I didn't attest that there was.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure these are points of common ground. The next point, in your proof of evidence at 4.2.15, you quote from the Historic England GPA 3, where you say that the settings of heritage assets which closely resemble the setting at the time the asset was constructed or formed are likely to contribute particularly strongly to the significance. Just on that point, as a matter of fact, the church is a 12th century heritage asset.
It has 12th century origins.
Yeah.
It's not purely a 12th century heritage asset.
Yeah, and the field, as it exists in its current form today, is a 20th century arrangement.
It has some 20th century arrangement, but it's not purely 20th century arrangement. You've still got certain field boundaries that are eminent from older time periods.
Yeah, but I'm saying the field as it exists today, its current arrangement is from the 20th century.
Elements of it are, not all of it.
Okay, I understand your distinction. But in terms of there being, whether the heritage asset closely resembled the setting at the time, the field as we sit here today does not resemble the field when the church was constructed or renovated, does it?
Well, not all of it, but there are still parts of it that do resemble that.
Well, in the Historic England GPA 3, it's talking about where you've got the setting which closely resembles that of the heritage asset. This doesn't closely resemble it, does it?
I would still say it does closely resemble. You've still got that element of open space. The field boundaries may have changed, but there's very little development in those field boundaries that would change the setting. It's still rural. It's still open. There are a few modern tweaks to it, but that overall is still an open area.
I mean, you say a few modern tweaks. Please go back to the tithe map, if you would, please. It's in your appendices, page 4.
Yeah, I just lost it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Yeah. That top northern section, do you see just below where it says 213
Yes.
on the tithe map? Yeah, that whole top section, which is a comparable size to 206, isn't it? As we see it on plan form.
It's slightly smaller, but I guess it's comparable for.
Yeah, that's all been lost now. It's a different field.
It is a different field, but it's still a field. There's not development in that field that you couldn't appreciate the open character.
Yeah, but in terms of this being a preserved and the setting being closely resembling, it doesn't. You've now got hedgerow that completely divides these two hedges, these two fields, 208 and 207, and are completely different arrangement.
I still think that it's close enough, and it closely resembles what was originally open lands. A hedgerow may divide it, but you can still appreciate it as open land.
Okay, next point, I want to ask you about the conservation area appraisal, which is core document F1.
Yes.
Now, in that document, if you go to page 6 of the document, please.
Yes.
We can see that this is the draft management plan at the top, with text in red.
I don't have that on my copy.
Page 6 of core document F1
Yeah.
should say at the top, Appendix 1, draft for executive. Am I alone in that?
That's not what I've got. This is the finalised.
I think, to be fair to you, you've got what we've all got, which is whatever went through the minds of those who prepared the core documents list. They didn't see fit to put in the final version. They gave you the version that the executive was presented with together with the covering report. I think that's what you've got, so what I've got. It appears the witness has got the final version, but then she would have, because she's the conservation officer. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have it, but what we appear to have is a draft.
I apologise, I didn't notice that that was what was submitted.
That's okay. It simply means I think we will need to have that as of just for the sake of completeness that you actually...
Well,
Maybe there's no difference, but probably we need to be
yeah.
This is
Is it a draft or is it?
Well, it was what was... It's a draft in the sense that until the executive resolved to approve it, it wasn't the final version. Whether in substance it differs one jot is another matter.
So has it? It has been approved though.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I may say, look, do you have you looked at what is in F1? Well, if I can just give you my copy, we better just get
I've got
this
it.
clear.
Kate's given me the copy
Good.
that's in F1.
Sorry.
I don't think from the executive meeting there were any comments made by the executive that changed the document from this one to the one that was formally adopted. It's just a formal process.
Best way of dealing with it, I think, is if we can get the final version and
That's
we'll
no
read it
problem.
overnight. If there's no difference, fine, we'll leave it as it is. If there is a difference, we'll tell you.
Okay, yeah, I will make sure that's emailed across.
Thank you very much. I've got no further questions.
Okay. Thank you.
So before the witness is discharged, I mean, I haven't got any re-examination, I don't think, but for one question, which is this. You were asked about the HER,
Yes,
and you said you'd looked at it,
yes.
and I think you told us that it indicates certain things. What did it indicate?
It indicated earthworks to the north of the church and a medieval deer park as well to the north.
Yeah. Do you happen to know what those earthworks were?
We can't say without archaeological investigation, and that hasn't been done. There is a theory that those earthworks relate to a abandoned medieval settlement.
Yes. Well, that is something I'd like to pick up with you, if I may. Could I take you to F1 of your core document F1, please? Which is-
Shall I use your version?
Yes,
Yeah.
you'd better. Because if we just turn to page 17. Paragraph 7.7.
Oh,
I'll read out the bit I'm looking at.
at 7 point.
7.7, bottom left-hand corner, heading medieval. I'll read it out to you, if that's okay. This period sees initial shaping of the landscape we see around Churchill today, with the creation of strip lynchets and ridge and furrow, both medieval agricultural practices. Several deserted settlements, including a possible deserted medieval village to the north of the manor, are scattered around the village. Most of these were farmsteads. You may see that now. What I want to be clear on is this. You say you've seen the HER, you've told us that it talks about earthworks. Is the reference there, do you know, to a possible deserted medieval village to the north of the manor? What is meant by the north of the manor? You wrote this document. If you don't know the answer, tell me, but where is the north of the manor so far as this particular sentence is concerned?
I didn't actually write this part of the document. Our archaeologists did, but I believe the north of the manor is there is a piece of open land to the north of just to the north side of the church, and that's where the point is on the HER.
Yeah, right. So where it's talking about to the north of the manor, as I understand your last answer, just be clear, are you talking about immediately to the north of the church?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, I'm talking about immediately north of the church.
Now, I don't want to introduce documents for the sake of it. You're taking their re-examination, it may or may not disclose anything. If we were to actually look at the HER, would we see any more than we've just read? Is there anything in there that's going to inform the inspector about any facts as to the nature of what is the north of the church, or is it pretty outline? Well, actually, we can. You took the witness there in cross-examination. I'm entitled to re-examine on any document to which you referred the witness. The fact is we haven't got the document in front of us.
I said what documents have we got before the inquiry?
Yes.
The witness reference documents not before the inquiry.
No, I agree.
And you are now asking them to just reveal the contents of that.
Well, I am, because A, your witness, if we were to go to his proof at paragraph 4.8, refers to CDF.1, he will have read what's in CDF.1, which includes what I've just referred the witness to. And secondly, the witness was asked about the evidence she has for a settlement around the church. She told you it was in the HER, and all I'm asking for is to know what's in the HER, and I'm entitled to do that in re-examination because the question arises directly from what's put in cross-examination. But what I'm entitled to do as well is ask the witness whether what is written in the HER sheds any more detail, sheds any more light on what is there than what we see written under 7.7. So if the witness tells us there is more there, then sir, I think we probably ought to produce it. If the witness says there isn't or she doesn't know, I'm going to leave it there now. Forgive me.
Sorry, the proper way to produce the document is just to introduce it. It's not to say, does the document mirror another document?
No. Well, I don't mind just introducing it, but before I do, I'd like to make sure there's some point to it. But if you'd like me just to say put the document in, that's absolutely fine, I'll just do that. So, forgive me, sir, that we're having a conversation across you, which is jolly rude.
No, well, I think it's helpful to get your views on it. The point is, it's not before the inquiry. We've got a document before the inquiry that you've just read from that references the issue that you're discussing. I think seems the only person that has perhaps read the document is the witness.
I don't think so. I think Mr. Sutton did a HER search of the area as part of the heritage appraisal. I'm not sure if the scope would have included what the HER search does is you set a certain circular boundary around the asset you're looking at, and it pulls out all the monuments within that boundary. So it may have been part of Mr. Sutton's HER search that he requested from North Somerset, but I can't be certain without knowing what that boundary was, and I'm not the HER officer, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I want to say we might do this. Shall we get hold of the HER insofar as it relates to the area to the north of the church? Just see what it says. If it turns out that it's material that is relevant to what we're talking about, then it can be formally introduced. If need be, this witness can deal with it, albeit very briefly. And Mr. Sutton can, to the extent he thinks he needs to. But we'd better see what's in it having been a matter that we've all had to think and talk about. To have it sort of sitting out there as some sort of unknown entity seems a bit unsatisfactory.
Okay. So obviously that would mean more inquiry time, the parties having a chance to consider it. So are you suggesting that you're going to go away tonight and do that, or?
Well, if it requires any original research to be done, sir, I don't think it ought to be done at all. If it's just something which exists,
Yeah.
a document that presumably was also supplied to the appellant in the way that the witness has just described, all I'm suggesting we do, sir, is produce it for you at the inquiry as a matter of record. I've no desire to recall my witness. I can't really see the point. If what we see is what... If we can read what is produced and make sense, but I won't recall the witness to talk about it. What I can do, though, is put it to Mr. Sutton to the extent that I think it's useful, and it may not be useful at all. It may tell us absolutely nothing, actually.
So you may or may not produce that tomorrow and attempt to submit
I won't be producing it tomorrow.
Sorry,
sir,
tomorrow on
we're having a
Friday.
day off. But
Sorry, on Friday.
I think what I'd like to do, sir, is this. We've been told there is an HER. It may or may not shed light on the question, was there a settlement around the church? To the extent it does, I will suggest that you would want to have it in front of you. Actually, sitting here right now, I have no inclination at all to recall my witness. I can't see the point. If we can read what we need to read, that will do for my purposes.
Just to curtail it, it's in the heritage assessment, HER is in the heritage assessment for this witness, Mr. Sutton, so it's in the court document, so you can ask Mr. Sutton about that.
Yeah, well, I'm assuming it's the same the witness would produce herself, but working on that basis, why don't we do that? I don't suppose it's going to be earth-shattering once we... These things often aren't, are they?
All right.
Well, so can I do this? The witness can read it. She can tell me whether she can produce anything different. If she can, I'll make an application to you on Friday morning to introduce it. But I would imagine what the learner friend tells us is going to provide a helpful way forward. It's earth-shattering, I should want to tell you.
All right. All right. Anything else?
One from Lisa. I warn you there's a document we're going to ask to put in. It's of no relevance to this week. It's to do with the planning evidence when we get to it. It's an extract from the council's options and...
Okay, I should, hang on, I should just say, I've not got any questions of your heritage witness. Thank you very much for the evidence that you've given. So you can relax while we move on to talk about other matters. Okay, sorry.
So effectively, it's an extract. Sorry, sir. It's effectively an extract from what is essentially the issues and options stage of the new local plan that's being prepared. So I think there's an extract from the preferred options document in the core document bundle, but this is the document that preceded that, and it's an extract from that document.
It's about the planning.
Fine, I suppose all I'd like to know is why is it being produced and what am I to take from it?
There are two headings. One is constraints to development. The other is retain the green belt.
Fair enough.
That should probably give you a hint.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
No, thank you, sir.
Okay. I want to just mention one point that everybody's sort of well aware of. I'm not proposing you sort of have a discussion now, but as we talked about in the case management conference, there's two appeal decisions that are sort of, if you like, in the pipeline. You'll probably know more clearer than I, well, as clear as I am as to when we might expect them. But next week, when we do get into 5-year land supply, inevitably they'd be highly relevant, but it could well be that there could be a number of scenarios. We have to deal with them there and then, or ultimately I could proceed to conclude the inquiry and we could respond to them sort of after that. I just ask you to sort of give that some thought. No doubt, I suspect you've talked about it already, but if you haven't, can you perhaps have a conversation and discuss what we might do in response to those scenarios? And maybe we can pick that up when we come back on Friday.
Yes, because what we've learnt this afternoon, sir, is the appeal in relation to Rectory Farm, which was being heard by Harold Stevens. There had been a bit of a delay in getting a decision out because Natural England were being consulted on the HRA, shadow HRA. And Harold Stevens has told us all today he's got enough information now to issue his decision. And I think we can expect it fairly soon.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe that might come on Friday, who knows? But it'd be worthwhile to have a discussion about sort of what we should do in the event.
After the inquiry, that be prepared for what?
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Okay, so that's really, unless there's anything else that anybody wants to put to me today. No. That concludes the day, really. If you've got the attendance sheet, you can hand that back to me.
What is, there's a timetabling matter, so if I might trouble you very briefly.
Yeah.
I'm taking a judgment on the 15th of this month. It's not my choice, sir. I did a case just before this inquiry opened. The judgment is going to be handed down on the 15th. I'm aware of what the draft is. And there are cost implications that I need to deal with. I've got to apply for costs on behalf of my client because we won. And the judge was told by me that I was in a planning inquiry on the 15th. Nonetheless, the judge has said, well, 9:30 I will hand down judgment, and we've got an hour allowed for costs. Now, so on that date, we happily, at this stage, are dealing with conditions where you wouldn't expect me to be doing very much to help you anyway, because, of course, council generally don't. What I wanted to flag up, sir, if I may, and to make a request of you to think about rather than to respond to now is, so would you mind considering whether I might be excused from this inquiry for an hour at 9:30 to 10:30 on the 15th of June? If your answer is, thank you, Ms. Leader, but I've thought about it, the answer is no, I can tell those who instruct me that the answer is no, and we'll have to deal with it in the best way, sir. But at the moment, it does look that the timetable, as if the timetable would allow me to attend that matter for an hour at least.
Well, yeah, as you said, I think it's quite usual to deal with conditions and the obligations without the assistance of the lawyers. Are you happy with that?
Yes, sir. Whether we push it back or whether Mr. Leader and I don't attend, I'm agnostic.
I want to get on with it, so I think probably the simplest thing would be to say, did you say 9:30 till 10:30 to simply just be excused from it?
Thank you very much.
Okay. While we're on such matters, it'd be worthwhile to, the same on that day as the site visit. I've not said either way my preference for undertaking that site visit, accompanied as the discussion's gone on. I've got a detailed itinerary, may well be other locations to add to that. I just wondered, it may well be more efficient for me to do that unaccompanied, but I just wondered what your views would be.
Doesn't cause any difficulty doing a public rights of way, does it? Going across the site. Yes, so we've sorted that you can walk across the public rights of way, so we're content for however you best want to do it.
Yeah, would the council have any views on that?
No, unaccompanied is fine, sir.
It would seem there would be quite a lot of distance to cover, and it would be quite difficult for everybody to sort of trail around after me and cover it. So unless things change, I think I would proceed on that basis. Okay. So got the attendance sheet. Tomorrow, so there is just the one thing that just to keep in mind. The council's team did say that they were considering the ecology matter. So presume, because you've not mentioned anything to me, there's been no.
The ecologist is looking at it. I believe they've formed some conclusions. I think I owe you a response on Friday morning at latest.
Okay. Yep. Okay. All right. So Friday, we'll hear the appellant's heritage evidence, with the afternoon kept reserved. Tomorrow I'll go out and do those site visits that I said that I was going to do. Yeah, I think that's everything for today. So at 5 o'clock, the inquiry is adjourned until Friday at 9:30. Thank you.